the Western alliance has a combined gross domestic product of about $40 trillion. Russia's economy is 1.8 trillion. So we're 20 times the size of Russia. If we wanted to cripple Putin's economy, we could easily.
As an overview, how would you sum up the state of Russia's economy at the moment?
Yeah, well, the first thing to note is that Putin, the one person who knew this war was going to happen was Putin, right? So he's been preparing it for a very long time. I would say perhaps a decade. You can go back to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 when the West first imposed sanctions. He knew he was going to invade, right? And he built up Russia's reserves, I should say. He deleveraged the economy, made it less vulnerable to Western sanctions. Foreign exchange reserves at the onset of the war were about $640 billion. That's over 500 billion pounds, right? So he had all these reserves. So when he invaded, and he knew sanctions were going to come, there was a lot of durability there already, right? And obviously, initially he benefited from high energy and oil prices because also he created that, if you remember, just before the invasion, there was a lot of pressure on energy markets. People were worried about impact on energy supplies to Europe. So oil and energy prices increased. He benefited from that as well. It meant more revenues came in, so that helped him. So there's a lot of durability. Aggressive sanctions were imposed. Some of those resources have been eroded. Around $330 billion of that $640 billion I mentioned of foreign exchange reserves were immobilized in Western jurisdictions. So he's kind of halved his availability of foreign currency reserves. Sanctions have begun to bite. They've reduced those buffers, made Putin make difficult choices. Increased defense spending means less resources for elsewhere in the economy, less social spending, less spending on the economy. Russia's been converted to a war economy, right? And that, difficult choices have been made. Growth has been lower overall. I think actually not just since the invasion, but again, if you think of the last decade, the sanctions and the policies that Russia has put in place to alleviate the impact of sanctions have meant that Russia has grown a lot weaker, a lower pace of growth than it would otherwise have been the case. Inflation's been higher. So there's been some pain, but the economy hasn't crashed. And it hasn't crashed because he had those buffers in place. And I think in the end, sanctions have been too weak, right? I mean, that's the reality. And I think the reason they're too weak is because in the end, I think for sanctions to work, the countries imposing them have to be willing to bear some cost. And actually what's happened is with all these sanctions packages, it's been the sanctions by the highest common denominator. So basically some country within the Western alliance has always got an excuse of why their industry, their banking sector, their companies are going to get hurt. So let's not do them. So we've had lots of excuses and reasons to weaken and moderate the sanctions. And I think in the end, it shows that Western countries haven't really taken the threat from Putin seriously. If we saw this as a really big threat, a threat to our national security, we would do whatever it takes to beat Putin and beat Russia. And if we're unwilling to shoulder the burden, take some of the cost, it kind of shows really an unwillingness to take the whole thing seriously. If you think about it, a different way to look is the Western alliance has a combined gross domestic product of about $40 trillion. Russia's economy is 1.8 trillion. So we're 20 times the size of Russia. If we wanted to cripple Putin's economy, we could easily, but we haven't really been willing to do whatever it takes. And I think, you could say that's about the economy. You could say about defense spending. Lots of different areas. In the end, for far too long, we have just not taken the threat from Putin seriously, which is one reason why he was able to get away with invading Ukraine in the first place.
Are there other sanctions that the West could be implementing that would turn the screw on Putin?
Well, there's been a lot of focus on weak enforcement. Lots of countries not in the Western alliance, but around Russia, have been helping Russia get around the sanctions. There's something called secondary sanctions. So basically, where you identify countries that are trying to benefit from sanctions by allowing Russia to break them, you sanction them. You send a clear message that, you may not want to join our sanctions regime. You don't want to be part of the Western alliance against Russia in this instance, but we don't want you to try and help Russia break the rules. So, countries in the Middle East, the Gulf, Turkey, Central Asia, we could be more aggressive in how we police sanctions to tighten the grip. There's a lot of what's called dual use goods that are getting into Russia, maybe consumer durable microchips, whatever, that you can use in a washing machine, but you can use in a tank. So we just need to be cleverer, more aggressive in terms of how we police them, tighten the screws on Russia. Because look, initially sanctions were imposed because of the annexation of Crimea and then Russia's annexation Russia's invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion. I think it's pretty clear now that Russia is a long-term threat to us. Putin hates Western liberal market democracy. He hates the way we work, the way we're governed. He wants to destroy that. He's at war with us. He's made it clear that he's at war with us. That's been the messaging from him and Russian state TV. So we need to make sure that Russia cannot regenerate its military machine that's been destroyed in Ukraine. And so sanctions have to remain for a long time, a bit like North Korea. We need to weaken him longer term. So we need to be cleverer, more aggressive. We could do more within the existing sanctions regime. There is also a really interesting idea that's been put around by someone called Nigel Gould-Davis of a think tank, former ambassador to Belarus. He argues that, in the end, we need to send a really clear signal to Western business that you shouldn't really be doing any business with Russia, right? And he argues, and I actually agree with him, that we should set a date at some point in the future, maybe 3 or 5 years away, and we say Western business should move to zero trade with Russia. The default setting should be we shouldn't trade at all with Russia, aside from getting special licenses for things that are really critical, right? So I'm not saying we actually go to zero, but we concentrate businesses' minds, and they have to explain exactly why it's really important to buy a particular product from Russia or sell a particular product to Russia. I don't see why, for example, Western consumer companies should be selling yogurts. I mean, what's the benefit of that, right? Or beer. Why are we trading at all with this regime that is now a fascist regime that has invaded another countries, committing war crimes and actually genocide against Ukraine? I mean, this is all, the Putin regime is increasingly looking like Nazi Germany. Like, why are we doing this, right? So I think we need to be more innovative, think outside the box a bit. Putin does. Putin, he outmaneuvers us all the time by doing things illegally or, we play by the rules. If you play by the rules against Putin, we lose, right? So we need to just be a lot cleverer. The only solution is using frozen Russian assets. Make Russia pay for the war it's waging in Ukraine. And, I think it should be a political scandal, actually, that our governments are spending our money, our taxpayer money, is being used to fund the war in Ukraine and the reconstruction, while our governments are not willing to spend Russia's money sat in Western bank accounts. How is that possible? I just find it extraordinary. And you mentioned, William Hague has been supportive. David Cameron, one of the first things he did upon assuming the position of Foreign Secretary was to support this effort. The UK should be leading the charge within G7 to make sure this happened. I worry, actually, that UK Treasury, Hunt at the Treasury, they're finding excuses not to do it. And it has to be done. If this is not done, we don't fund Ukraine properly, we see macro instability and they lose the war. And as I said before, that means massively increased costs to all of us because of the threat from a resurgent Russia.
Longer term, hopefully once Ukraine has won this war, there will still be an enormous economic rebuilding job required for the country. What do you think is in store there? Do we need a Marshall Plan for the Ukrainian economy? Do we need to look at debt relief? What long term does Ukraine need?
Well, estimates of the damage, the World Bank and the Kiev School of Economics have done some work. At the moment, it's running around $500 billion, so $500 billion of damage. And it's every day gets bigger, right, as Russia inflicts more damage. So about $500 billion. Probably, it's very difficult to spend that in 1 year. I would imagine what is possible. Ukraine's about a $200 billion economy. It's feasible, probably, to spend about $50 billion on reconstruction. So that'll be over 10 years, something like that. So $50 billion a year over 10 years. If we see peace and Ukraine security is assured, I think Ukraine has a very good future. I think the 500 billion I mentioned, we can find from frozen Russian assets. Ukraine should be able to borrow in international capital markets. We can think of lots of different structures to help Ukraine fill that gap of $50 billion a year likely to the reconstruction recovery. And I think, the interesting thing is Ukraine now has the anchor of EU accession. One of the problems for Ukraine over the last 30 years, unlike Poland, the Baltic states, Hungary, Czech Republic, that have had remarkable and really successful recoveries from the communist period, was they were given the EU accession anchor. I mean, the thing about the EU accession story is, obviously Brexit, there were skeptics about the whole story, but actually EU accession provided a blueprint for reform for these countries. It was a checklist, what you needed to do, how you need to reform your judiciary, your regulatory environment, your banking systems, and countries just ticked the boxes, and it helped them, it simplified the process of reform, and it was successful. And a lot of international business, also when they thought that Poland or Czech Republic was going to join the European Union, they decided, well, these countries, they have cheap labor, good business environment. We want to invest. So a lot of money came in on the assumption that EU accession was going to happen. Ukraine never had that. The West never, or the European Union never gave it the green light to EU accession. It now has that. So I think that will help the reform process move forward. It will mean that international business will want to locate to Ukraine. And actually, one remarkable thing, and I've covered, I first went to Ukraine in 1987. I've covered the country as an economist for 30 years. The innovation I've seen from Ukraine has been remarkable. Think about drones. Their ability, Russia was a global superpower militarily with fourth, fifth generation military kit. Ukraine was like a third, fourth rate military power. And we could debate, why Ukraine hasn't won, how the counteroffensive failed, but to fight Russia to a standstill over 2 years, to stop the initial Russian invasion, was extraordinary. And it was successful because of this innovation that, Ukraine has a strong industrial base. They're clever people. They figured out, how to reprofile Western military kit to the best advantage. So I think that innovation that we've seen during the war will really help them in recovery. So
Russians generally die. Russians have a lot of fresh troops because they have to constantly replace their losses. For example, today I think I didn't check the statistics yet, but I think that we will have the biggest number of Russian vehicles destroyed since the beginning of the invasion in different parts of Ukraine. Yesterday we already counted something like 60 vehicles that were eliminated, judging from the OSINT, from videos that we had. Russians keep bringing fresh troops. They don't have fighting fatigue because they die. They don't live that long. Our guys, unfortunately, they keep feeling tired, but they keep fighting because there's nowhere for us to run.
I suppose one of the other big challenges with fresh waves of mobilization of Ukrainian troops is the supplies. It comes down to, you can have extra men on the front line fighting, but if you haven't got the equipment, if you haven't got fresh military aid and weaponry to support them, that's going to present huge operational challenges.
Absolutely, it's a combined arms, combined forces doctrine. We have to have vehicles. Again, this is another reason why, for example, Russia's claims that they can bring like 1 million troops to Ukraine doesn't make sense, because troops without vehicles, without proper supplies, they don't work. When the day Russia brings 1 million troops to Ukraine and concentrate them in the same location will be the happiest day for the Ukrainian artillery operators. So you have to have vehicles, you have to have proper supplies, you have to have good logistics in order to be able to mobilize that many soldiers. And again, we are talking about the supplies from our Western allies. They must understand that this is something hilarious and incredible at the same time. Russian professor and political scientist that is a big friend and supporter of Vladimir Putin last week stated that Ukrainians used humanoid drones programmed to hit civilians in the Crocus City Hall in Moscow. Then several days ago, Russian former chief for the Russian Interpol and his advisor for the Ministry of Interior, he's a Russian major general, actually. He said that this attack was performed by the terrorists that had microchips installed in their brain, and they were psychologically programmed to do that. This is crazy. Worst thing that people in Russia specifically, they believe this misinformation, because Russians involve all kinds of speakers, and those people are of a pretty high level. They're like PhD, they're doctors, they're former authorities of the top level, and they spread this absolutely ridiculous misinformation that people in Russia keep consuming. It's crazy.
It is interesting, though, that it could be a moment of danger for Vladimir Putin internally, because he's there dismissing the threat posed, the very real threat posed by ISISK to Russia, and instead trying to baselessly claim that somehow Ukraine were involved, when his intelligence services are telling him, no, there's a genuine threat from ISISK. And if there is a kind of division between the Russian intelligence services and Vladimir Putin, long term, that could be very dangerous for him.
I would say that it's a bit opposite. Even though he was warned, by the way, by Iran, we know from Reuters, for example, that Tehran warned him about it, about the possible attack, and other agencies. But actually, I think this terrorist attack was rather like blessing for Putin. He was really happy that it actually happened in Russia. So now he can blame Ukraine. He can demonize the Western world, and this gives him opportunity to launch, for example, another wave of mobilization. Recently, Russians photoshopped, those postmarks that we had. We had a postmark of a Ukrainian soldier showing a finger to the Russian warship and things like that. And they did something very similar with burning Crocus Hall, and basically they tried to blame Ukraine, and they tried to say that Ukrainians posted those postmarks to celebrate the terrorist attack in Moscow. So we see that this misinformation has some kind of goal that they're trying to reach. And in my opinion, because according to military culture, nothing happens just because. Everything happens for a reason, and everything has some kind of goal. And in my opinion, this goal is to further demonize Ukrainians in the eyes of Russians, because we don't give them enough reasons to do that. We don't strike Russian civilians deliberately. We don't strike Russian residential buildings. We don't torture their prisoners of war, and we don't do all those things that Russians do to Ukrainians. That's why they keep demonizing us. And apparently, I think one of the goals is opportunity to launch a new mobilization.
So Putin's almost using the Krokus City Hall attacks as a kind of false flag operation, not to suggest that Russia somehow staged that. I'm not saying that, but in terms of how he's spun it to justify his campaign against Ukraine. Something else you mentioned, Operator Starsky, a moment ago was the way that Russia is trying to undermine the messaging among Ukrainians, so that Ukrainians feel somehow they're being abandoned by the West. And of course, there are legitimate concerns about, for example, the lack of renewed military aid from the US Congress. So there would be understandable grievances, I suppose, from Ukrainians. But just talk to me a bit about some of the tactics that Putin is using there to try and undermine the solidarity there is between the West and Ukraine.
So they're constantly bombarding Ukrainian society through Telegram channels, for example, through different so-called independent media, with messages that, for example, Europe is trying to find a solution to force Ukraine to negotiate with Putin, and basically they're trying to say that the Western countries like Germany, like France, which are some of our strongest allies, like the UK, by the way, they're trying to convince Ukraine to capitulate. And this is something that we heard back in 2022, but these days this information is absolutely massive. According to German authorities, for example, the Russian misinformation on Ukraine and on the Western countries grew several times comparing to the last year.
You mentioned a moment ago how Putin is using the attacks the other week to justify a fresh wave of mobilization. We've seen that now. He signed a decree authorizing a spring military conscription, which will draft around 150,000 Russians between April and July. We've spoken a lot before on Frontline about the very high Russian casualty rate. But I mean, how big a worry is it that even though the casualty rate for Russia is enormously high, they can sustain it, it would seem at the moment, because Putin doesn't care about Russian casualties?
This is their usual tactic. Basically, they know that they have never-ending source of human material, right? Of personnel that they can literally throw into meat assaults, and this is their tactics. It's ridiculous from the European standpoint. We don't fight like that. We don't just sacrifice our soldiers in such amounts. But to Russia, it is and it was their common culture of combat, common doctrine. And they know that they can compensate whatever losses they have because they have huge population, and of course they have huge stockpile of ammunition and vehicles. This is again something very concerning because, for example, there was estimation that the UK doesn't have enough artillery to fight against Russia if Russia invades, for example, the United Kingdom. Russians have such resources because they were stockpiling artillery shells for decades since the World War II. During the Cold War, they grew their storage, their arsenal of weapons, because we know that they were selling them, they were giving them to other countries during the Cold War and in the 90s as well. So unfortunately, they have this opportunity. Again, if we take a look at annual GDP, Russia has smaller annual GDP than Italy, for example. And the sizes of those territories cannot be compared. But at the same time, this is a good answer to the question why people in Italy live in better conditions than people in Russia, where 2/3 of people of population live in absolute poverty. This is because they have different strategies. Italy has social policies and things like that. Russia is stockpiling weapons like crazy since 1945. That's the only answer to this.
Where are we with fresh waves of mobilization in Ukraine? I know President Zelensky said just before Christmas that he felt it might need to be up to 500,000 more troops mobilized by Ukraine. Where are we with that? What's the latest?
So the latest news that we have is that the mobilization law is already almost complete, like 90% complete, and there will be a lot of changes introduced to the initial project of this legislation, because there were a lot of things that must have been changed to make sure that this law corresponds to human rights and things like that. So there were a lot of consultations with different experts and committees of the Ukrainian parliament regarding this. And we will see this law, I think, adopted maybe this month already. Again, the problem, like the global problem in Ukraine regarding the mobilization and regarding the troops, is that our personnel is fighting for more than 2 years already non-stop. Our soldiers have opportunity to take a vacation, for example, for like 30 days, see their families, but still those people keep fighting, and if we don't change them, we don't know how much time this war takes, maybe years, maybe a decade, and those guys must be replaced. They must take some rest, and they must be replaced. So this is the current situation.
In some ways, the sort of Russian imperial moment that we're going through is a kind of a long-awaited reaction to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when the western half of Russia, the Russian Empire, is torn away or is brought away by the Central Powers, and you have the creation of these nominally independent states. Obviously, they're under Central Powers control, but nominally independent states that carve out their own destinies, and you have the resurgence and the recovery, a rebirth of Poland. And obviously Ukraine, Ukraine comes about in 1918. They are delegates at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and despite initially supporting them, the Bolsheviks, as soon as Ukraine comes into being, the Bolsheviks try and invade and try and snuff out that, because they recognize that without Ukraine, can Russia be a great power? Now, obviously, they're very different to the Tsars and the imperial state, but they still have that sort of innate sense of that kind of superiority, really, and that Russia has to have this sort of region where it controls. And so, in some ways, it's a reaction to that. It's an idea that these states that were emerged after the First World War really still belong to Russia, and they haven't really, they're only really free because it's all sort of a plot by the West or a plot by Germany or whatever. But actually, these are real states. These have their own national identities and national stories. And I think that's part of the Russian desire to wipe the slate clean and recover the Tsarist position that it held in 1914.
How do you think the First World War is viewed by ordinary Russians today? I mean, the Second World War looms, I would imagine, far larger in the psyche, seen as a great victory over European aggressors. But where does the First World War sit in the Russian psyche now, Nick?
Well, it's difficult because it's all related to the revolution, of course. Obviously, in the Soviet period, the revolution was the founding moment of the USSR, and a moment that was much mythologized in propaganda, in literature and film. The idea that the class system collapsed, it was overthrown by the people. And obviously, this was slightly, there are two revolutions in 1917. There's the abdication of the Tsar. There's the formation of the provisional government, and then you have the Bolshevik coup d'etat in November. So the revolution, really is the story of Russia's story in the war. Once the USSR, the Soviet Union, collapses, the revolution becomes, somewhat more problematic, because obviously the last thing Putin really wants people to think about is how to overthrow a corrupt autocratic regime. So the revolution is, Putin is a creature of the USSR, so he has a certain, fondness for this kind of thing, but it's inherently political, and so there is a certain wariness towards it. At the same time, you do have a kind of growing cult of personality around the Tsar, the execution of the Tsar and his family, and that idea that he sort of symbolizes a kind of good Russia, an orthodox Russia. And so his cult of personality and almost worship in some cases has grown quite considerably, really, since the end of the Soviet Union. And so he is still kind of had his moment where he's being revised, and instead of being seen as a somewhat ineffectual figure, but seen as a much more warmer sense. And so the memory of that war and that period is continually kind of evolving and shifting, but it is still a period, I think, of intense sort of unease, I think would be the right word, both in the Russian people, but also in the Russian elite as well.
How would you assess Vladimir Putin's worldview when it comes to the history of Russia and Europe over the past century or so? I mean, I don't know if you caught any of that remarkable interview he did with Tucker Carlson, where he essentially walks him through his theory of Russian history, and it was, pretty historically inaccurate in many places, but revealing as to his worldview. What did you make of that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very interesting, and I think it's important. History is often sort of dismissed as not being relevant or anything sometimes, but you look at someone like Putin, and history is very, very much there in his psyche and his identity, and his understanding of the world is historically based, though it may be not necessarily factually accurate, but it is deeply emotional and connected to him as a person and his worldview. The idea that, again, as I think I said before, those states that emerged after the First War aren't real states. They're not real people. They're actually just Russians who've been kind of seduced by the West or whatever. And so really their natural home is under Moscow's domination. And so that, he shares that view with generations of Russian autocrats in that sense. And so Putin will be much more recognizable to standard sort of Russian nationalists of the 19th century and so on and so forth. And so there isn't that much surprise or that much difference. I think perhaps for us in the West that aren't exposed to that, I think you can see how powerful historical understandings can be to someone who was determined to right the wrongs of history as he sees it, to get things back on the right track. And of course, not understanding that what happened in the First World War was that old empire collapsed. And when you have old empires collapsing, they're always violent, it's always difficult, huge upheaval that can take decades to work through. And obviously you have the period in the Second World War where, the Soviet Union really expands into Eastern Europe. That was a sort of right period where Russia had restored what it was naturally going to do. And so that really hasn't changed in the mindset of Putin. But I think it's very interesting how important historical reasoning is to him and his worldview, and we shouldn't underestimate that.
You do hear increasingly, Nick, people talking about whether we're on the brink of a third global conflict or even a kind of third world war, if you want to put it that way. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can understand fears and concerns of angering the Russian bear. And obviously you have a very, in some ways, very violent and very dangerous individual and a very violent and dangerous state. But I think there are still some things worth fighting for. And I think that sort of Ukrainian statehood is definitely worth fighting for. And so I think in some ways we have to get our heads down and make sure we do what's necessary. And in some ways, the best way to deter Russia is not through weakness, but through strength, through uncompromising strength and making sure that Ukraine can continue the fight. I think weakness only kind of breeds further ambition from Moscow in that sense. It only really reacts to force, it respects force. And I think we have to understand that. That might be quite difficult for us in the West to appreciate. But once you go there and understand this, I think you mean that you have no choice. You're going to have to take a stand on Russia. The question is, do you want to do it from a position of relative strength or a position of weakness? That's really the question you have to answer. Because by letting Russia get its way, you might not prevent World War III. You might actually bring it about.
Or almost appeasement Mark II.
Yeah, I mean, there are similarities in that sense. The belief that you can just sort of give you just give a little bit, or you can. Putin is not going to be satisfied with the Donbass or certain oblasts of Ukraine. He wants the whole thing, and we must understand that. And he might temporarily settle for some of those minor territorial adjustments, but ultimately the ideology is clear. The understanding of history is clear. He's not trying to hide it. Ukraine is a failed state. It's a fake state. It's not a real state. It needs to come back to Russia. That's the ideology. And there's, of course, a complete negation of Ukrainian history, which goes back well beyond, before the First World War and everything. So I think those are some of the points I think we need to bear in mind. We need to understand these people on their own terms and not interpret it, well, he might say that, but actually he means the other thing. Actually, dictators often say exactly what they want and what they mean.
And even were he to completely conquer Ukraine, God forbid, I mean, you can compare him to a shark. A shark needs to keep moving forward, and he wouldn't stop there.
Well, they may stop for a few years or whatever, but it won't fundamentally. It would certainly make the security situation in Europe very, very perilous. And so I think in some ways it's better to try and stop him where we can, before you allow him to get stronger.
Just finally, Nick, from writing the book, are there other lessons aside from how to approach dictators, for example? But are there other lessons that can be applied from the First World War to today's world?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen, certainly in Ukraine, I mean, we've talked about this, we've seen the resurgence of trench warfare, the re-emergence of trench warfare. And if you look at some of the photos and the video images from some of those areas of heavy fighting, it would, you put it in a black and white filter and it's straight out of the Western Front. Something like Passchendaele, we have the splintered trees and things. So it's really interesting from my perspective to see the things like people talking about shell shortages, which we haven't really talked about for decades. And we think from a military perspective, we talked about maneuver and high tempo operations and precision. Actually, what we're seeing now is a more real war, which is about mass attrition, mass death, the amount of artillery shells you can fire. It's about indecisive slogs forward. And so the First World War has a lot of parallels and a lot of things we can draw from that. And ultimately, you need to be able to bring in mass. So we need to rearm. We need to be able to provide, a capability that is, that you can reinforce and you can bring in more shells, bring in more troops, bring in more guns, more tanks. That's something that in the West we really don't want to hear, but it is the ultimate lesson. If you're fighting attritional warfare, you're going to need to do that. And so Ukraine has been a really powerful reminder, whether governments want to hear it or not, but a powerful reminder that war takes mass people, mass equipment, and potentially mass death. That is war, and that's much more of a sort of a standard in international relations than the period we've had of precision, very, very precise, exquisite warfare. Ukraine has shown, I think, the real face of war that, again, is remarkably consistent with what we find in the First World War. I mean, Ukraine is the First World War with drones.
The United States actually told the Russian government on 6th of March that the terrorist attack is going to happen. Now we know that they actually mentioned that particular concert hall, Kronos City Hall. We also now know that Iranian government informed the Russian government that they have sources saying that there is going to be a terrorist attack in Moscow. And instead of trying to prevent it, Putin went to Collegium of the FSB. Collegium of the FSB is the ruling structure of the FSB. This is like Politburo in the old Soviet Union. So instead of saying that they should be watching for a terrorist act, he told them that this is a provocation and a blackmail of the United States and that they should not react. And that's why, despite all these, notifications, there was no police force present at all during that particular concert, although that particular concert hall was named. What probably is an indication that for reasons which are unclear, the Russian government made a decision to let this terrorist act to happen. And the question is why. And I think we do have, by now, we have at least two indications that we think we know the answer why. First, a major discussion about the abolition of moratorium for death penalty happened in Russia after that particular terrorist act. And we heard the, voices not only of Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia and former prime minister of Russia, who was kind of demanding to return death penalty, but also from many members of the Russian parliament. So we still do not know if they would return death penalty to Russia, but this might be one of the reasons the government decided to let this terrorist act to happen. So, this would be used as a reason for returning death penalty. And secondly, starting 22nd of March, when the terrorist act took place, that's the only topic everybody is discussing. Indeed, during the same period, the Russian army actually destroyed the city of Kharkov in Kiev, in Ukraine. City of Kharkov is the second largest city in Ukraine after Kiev. It's very close to the Russian border, and it takes Russian missiles 40 seconds to hit the city from the Russian border. And since Ukrainians do not have now assistance from the United States and everything is kind of frozen with the support, they do not have air cover, of course, and they do not have anti-missile equipment to shut down missiles, and the city is destroyed, literally. And it's 1.3 million population city, and they're using bombs for the first time during the war. For this war, the Russian planes are just bombing the city from the airplane, which again are staying in the Russian airspace and firing those, self-propelled, whatever, bombs from the Russian territory into Kharkov, and no one is talking about Kharkov because everybody is talking about this terrorist act.
It seems strange, though, that President Putin would want to divert attention from that, given what's gone on since the full-scale invasion anyway.
Well, again, the Russian government used this terrorist act for propagandistic purposes as well. He is saying that Putin precisely was saying that this is done by Ukrainians, although, of course, for people who were arrested, beaten, tortured, presented to Russian public, they do not look like Ukrainians, to be honest. But nevertheless, the government is claiming that this is done by Ukrainians, but this is impossible to sell even to the Russian public, I have to tell you, because the situation is kind of obvious. It's obvious that this was an Islamic terrorist act, but again, propaganda is using this for its purposes as well, without great success. Well, this probably lie. They announced actually that they're going to draft additional 100,000 people into the army before the terrorist act. So this was announced, and they plan to draft somewhere between 100 and 500,000 people into the army. I do not know how successful this draft is going to be, because the last time when they announced that they are drafting 300,000 people into the army, at the end they managed to collect this amount of young men, but we know that probably the same amount of young men left Russia during this process because the border is still open. So I would say that every time they are announcing that they are going to draft, 100,000 or 500,000 people into the army, the similar amount of people probably live in Russia again. And what means that they take young men from the Russian economy, which it's struggling. It's struggling not in the sense that it's in terrible shape. No, it is not. But it's working like 24 hours, 7 days a week to support the production of military weapons for the war. So if they take out of this economy from 200,000 to 1 million people, it's probably going to be felt by economists. So I do not think that they're able to draft, 500,000 people as they plan, but they probably will be able to have like additional 100 to 200,000.
We're in this unique situation because the first time in history you say the secret security services, the FSB, run and continue to run a country. How do you think the correct attitude and policy should be towards Russia?
You mean starting 2000 or today? Because now we have a major help, and this help is coming from Ukraine because Russia attacked Ukraine, provoked the war, hoping that this will be like a blitzkrieg and everybody will capitulate like a country after country. They never believed that Ukraine would agree to fight, would start to fight against Russian aggression. This was not the plan, and this is the only hope to bring a change to Russia. Otherwise, Putin would stay as a president until he dies, whenever he will die. And again, there is no internal opposition in Russia. There are no internal forces which are able to change anything in Russia. And you mentioned Navalny, but that's precisely why Putin was killing him. So they preventively kill all potential leaders. The border is open, and a lot of Russians, and we are talking about hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Russians, they left Russia. So only those people who actually, I do not want to say that everybody who lives in Russia today supports Putin. That's not what I want to say. But all those active people who already actively oppose Putin, to fight against Putin, they're either in prisons, and there are not too many of them, or they emigrated because they realize that it's just make no sense. You cannot change regime peacefully in Russia. You could change it only, sorry to say this, through revolutionary war, right, against the Russian government, against the current Russian government, and there are no possibilities for this because the weapons are controlled by three groups, basically: the FSB, the Russian army, and the Rosgvardia, which is like internal personal military force of Putin, right? So there is no opposition. There are no political parties which are fighting for power against Putin. This was done slowly, starting 2000, and the result is that there is no even theoretical possibility that this regime might be changed internally. This is not going to happen. So the only hope actually was brought to us by Ukrainians. Because if Russia is defeated in this war, then of course the regime will be changed. And so we're coming back to the same issue, whether to hope that Putin himself will stop, decide that one day that, well, the war is not going well, let's stop it, let's try to be friends with the West. And I do not think this is going to happen because, we had this people in Russia, ruling Russia before, Soviet Russia before, right? For Lenin, this was World Revolution. For Trotsky, this was permanent revolution. For Stalin, this was just, military occupation of one country after another country. And by 1941, by the way, he took the half of Europe. So Putin is basically continuing where Stalin, stopped. That's what he is planning to do. He is planning to return Eastern Europe under the Russian influence first, and then, proceed further again with the speed which is possible or allowed.
You have said before that Putin doesn't care how many people have to die in the war in Ukraine, that he equates the high death toll with a great war in a kind of quasi-Stalinist kind of way. At the moment, as you've said, Ukraine is being supported to be able to keep up the fight but not win it. Can the war still be contained and won in Ukraine?
Well, it could be contained in Ukraine, but to contain it in Ukraine and to win in Ukraine are two different goals, right? So far, the idea is that you help Ukraine, and again, it doesn't work for recent weeks because American Congress is still didn't make a decision allowing Ukraine to get American assistance. So far, this is not so. But basically, the idea is that Ukrainians will halt Russian aggression. So the West would help Ukraine as much as it needed to halt Russian aggression within Ukraine. And through this, the war will not spread beyond, because Ukrainians are holding Russians. But at the same time, Russia could not be allowed to lose this war, because if Russia would see that it's losing this war, then Russia would use nuclear weapons, because it would have no other choice. So the idea is to have this permanent war in Ukraine. The strategy, again, not to win, because to win means that Russia loses, and that's precisely what the Western world, unfortunately, I have to say, is trying to avoid, because he's afraid that as Russia is bluffing, if we see that we are losing the war, then we will destroy the entire world with nuclear weapons, because why do we need to exist if we are losing this war? So, and this bluff, ironically or not ironically, tragically, this bluff works. That's precisely why everybody is trying to help Russia not to lose this war. Otherwise, Russia would lose this war a long time ago. So, if the goal would be for Ukraine to win this war, not only Ukraine will win this war, but the risk of confrontation with Russia will be, finally destroyed and dealt with. So my point is that the only way for Europe to avoid the war is to allow Ukraine to win. Otherwise, sooner or later, this war will take place.
We've been in Kherson 6 months now. We came down to make a film, and there's not been a single day where the Russians haven't shelled us. Not a day. Because they're a mile away, they're 1.5 miles away on the other side of the Dnipro River. So where you see other places getting hit by Shahed drones and ballistic missiles, in Kherson, they don't need to do that. Standard artillery just pummels the city daily. So it's just part of life, and it's had a big effect. It was about 320,000 people. They estimate that about 30,000 people left, and that is due just to the Russian army, just with rockets and heavy artillery daily. They just hit the place.
And Paul, before we started this interview, you told me you've had to move house 4 times.
Yes. Well, we got here, and I think on the first day we just met some old babushkas on the street corner, and we were asking them about life. I was filming, and then the next morning we got a call saying, come to where you did the interview. And we went to outside the house where we did, and the house was gone, just absolutely flattened. And what had happened is someone had seen us. There's still a lot of collaborators, Russian, in the city, so you've got to be very careful. But they'd seen us, assumed it was our house, and the following morning it was just removed from the map. We went back to the place we'd moved. We were actually staying, and Zarina was on the Skype call. Then a grad rocket hit the back of the building and took out all the windows in that house. So we had this was within 3 days of being here, and we thought this is great. So now we moved to a kind of post-Soviet era housing block, which was quite anonymous. But the other day we went out to do an interview, and we heard the rocket. We went to meet a soldier, and we just heard the rocket go overhead, and to be honest, we didn't even think anything about it. You hear them that often. We had the huge explosion, went and did the interview, and we came back. And at first someone said the cafe where we drink coffee is being hit. So we went there, and he said, no, we think it's by your place. So we drove around, pulled up at our place, and looked up, and the apartment I'm looking at it now, it's about 10 meters away, had taken a direct hit. But our apartment, when we turned around and looked at it, it was like there was all the kitchen and living room area windows were blasted through. And we came up in the whole place that, there's now shrapnel holes in all the walls. And then they came and they call it Ukrainian glass. It's basically wood. They fit all the windows with wood. So now we live in like this kind of really dark hole. We got one little window like that lets light in. It's like permanent winter now. We just sit there kind of going. And then about 2 months ago, around Christmas, a shell came across and landed in the balcony below us, at the apartment below. And that was called a flechette. It was like an artillery shell, but it's full of about 2,000 small steel arrows. And that hit in the balcony below, missed us by about 4 meters, but filled the apartment below with these tiny, short, like stained steel arrows. So, yeah, we've had our share of misses here.
How does your documenting of this war compare with your other experiences? And do you feel that you have more of a reason to stay in Ukraine? Do you feel that you want to be there for the long haul?
Yeah, well, I think with Ukraine, because it was a long time after getting blown up in Syria, it was a long time before I could walk, and then, getting fit and healthy again. So there was a huge gap between the 2012 and when the Frontline Club, when it kicked off, they said, we want to train young journalists, do you fancy going out there? And I was like, yeah, I'll go on. So I wrote up a course, a 2-day HEFAT and safety course. And when you see the enthusiasm of the young journalists out there to cover it, that spreads. So I did my training, and I was like, oh, I wonder if I still have got, I hadn't been near an explosion since the explosion that killed Marie and got me. So I was unsure.
Yeah, so you're referring to, Paul, just sorry to interrupt, but just to explain to people that this is the experience that you had in Syria, where your colleague Marie Colvin died, and this was after covering the protests in Homs. Yeah. And you wrote about that in your book Under the Wire, which I mentioned at the beginning. Sorry, you were saying that I'm interested in what drives you really.
Well, it was I watched them going out, train them for 2 days and go out. And I mean, so I was like, yeah, good on you going, these are local journalists who were covering dog shows until Russia invaded, they were just doing what local journalists do. Then all of a sudden they're on the front. So I saw that, and I saw their enthusiasm. So I went out myself to take some pictures. And, I very quickly got over the kind of, will I be okay on the front line again? And then once I realized it was like, well, this is what I do. The kind of, I had that big break in between because of injury. But once I was there, and you just can't help but look at the Ukrainian spirit and go, yeah, I want to follow this through. And the film, it's the same with the film. We came for a few weeks, and it's like, no, there's more to it than a quick in-out film. This is like characters, and it's going to be a hell of an edit, because it's going to be a very, big story kind of woven into a narrative.
And when you take your pictures, your stills, what do you look for in a photograph in a place like Kherson or in Ukraine?
Well, it's like every picture. I kind of, I had the luxury of working with Marie, so it was kind of like, the words and the pictures always made up were great in the two parts. But when I take a picture, I'm quite aware that I'm trying to tell a story in one frame. And I never imagine putting captions on. I always think it should stand without captions. It should be a story in itself, and and it's different from shooting film. When I'm shooting film and video, I never shoot the same on the same day. I never do both, because they're such different things. With stills, you have to just sit and watch and really, really, really hone in and pick your moment, and try and capture the whole story in one go. Whereas with film, you're doing interviews, it's a different. So I keep them separate. And some days I'll go out just to do stills, and it's the ultimate objective is to tell the story in one picture, and that is a challenge. But when it comes off, it's also a really nice. I got it.
And Paul, what can you tell us about what did they tell you about living under Russian occupation?
Oh, horrendous! The stories, they're just. They were big on torture, so they suspected anybody. They had these torture chambers spread across the city. We went to one yesterday that was formerly a yoga studio, and they would, people went in and didn't, a lot went in and didn't come out. We've spoken to victims who did go through the machine, and just, it's brutal. But they're still there, and they're alive to tell the story, so they're telling their stories. But it was just so widespread, and they really tried to erase any sense of Ukraine. So we've got a lovely guy, Volodya, who tells us about every morning what was he described? They play their moronic anthem across the Russian national anthem across the big speakers in the square. And they'd raise the Russian flag, and and he laughs. He's saying, they were absolutely believed they could get rid of the Ukrainian concept of Ukraine. That's what they tried to. It's an example of what's in store for the country. If God forbid they break through, there will be there has been carnage, but if they break through and do what they've done everywhere else.
How are people feeling about you talk about how close the Russians are to where you are now. How afraid are they're going to come back?
There's always rumors. They are afraid, and they're quite they watch what's happening. They see the kind of world, the kind of plodding supply of weapons. That should be. They see this. They understand it. And obviously other things happen that take away some of the headlines. You get Palestine. Everybody knew when Israel and Gaza kicked off, a lot of journalists exodus and went to cover the next war. It's the circus moves on, but they're aware of that, and it's a genuine fear that the Russians will come back. There's no. They more than anyone know their capabilities, and they will fight to the last man. But without the weaponry and without the resources, it's horrendous. Thankfully here they can't just pop back across the river because the bridges went. So they'd have some warning because they'd have to go round and come down. So there's a bit of leeway, but there's always the latest rumours that the Russians come back, but. The evidence is Russia is rearming, is rebuilding, is remobilizing, and they are devoting massive 30% of their economy now is as a war economy. They're building, and that's just not happening.
What if? Tell me about meeting Ukrainian soldiers. What have they told you, and where have you been?
Oh, I was just out yesterday. I think it was. I was out with a unit. The artillery unit we were with, they were fantastic. They're just I was artillery as well, so I've got a bit of an affinity
Yeah.
with. But we arrived. We had to leave at 2 a.m. under the cover of darkness because of the drones, and they took
Where was
us.
this?
Where was it?
Where'd you
it was
go to?
just,
Yeah.
It was just up the river. I can't be too specific about
Precise.
it.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Somewhere up the river. And everything takes place at night, and we were taken out by red torch, and we just went down these muddy steps into this, basically an underground room with 4 guys in it, and they were like, hello, visitors. What are you doing here? But they were just lovely, such lovely guys. But I was saying, like, how long have you been in the artillery? And he said, oh, well, we found a gun. We found a Russian gun. And I was like, what? He said, it had no wheels and there were some bits missing. He said, but before that, we were a mortar unit, but then we found this gun, so we kept it. The Russians had abandoned it. And he said that over a couple of months, they found some wheels for it, and then they found some sights. And I was like, well, how did you learn to fire it? Did you go train? He said, oh, YouTube.
No.
And I just loved it. After, like, you learn to shoot it on YouTube, and they're going, yeah, we're actually pretty good shots. But they live this existence. They live underground and deep, about 6-7 foot underground with wooden beams and piles of earth. But they're using ammunition that they went out and scavenged in the woods, ammunition they found that the Russians had left behind. So everywhere you go, you get this sense that the ammunition is running out. You look at the eastern front of Divka up to around Kramatorsk, that area. The Russians are pushing, and we were speaking to one lad yesterday at a reconnaissance unit, and he said they are. He said there's a lot of the Russians are too thick, but he said they are learning, they are adopting. They're copying Ukraine tactics. So it's an ever-developing kind of, technological war with the drones, which are a complete game changer. But he said their tactics it's a mini arms race out there at the moment, certainly with the drones.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.